Hey folks, Chris Vandeviver here from Brass Palace Recording. I've got a video for you today that is the final video of a series that walks you through my particular mix template and workflow for mixing rock music. And my goal is for you to be able to glean some insights, some strategies, some philosophies, so that you can take your mixes and get to better decisions quickly, more efficiently, effectively, or just spawn new ideas for you to consider. In the first video, we tackled general organization of a session, gain staging, and drum processing. The second video tackled bass and guitar processing. And this third and final video, we're going to go into vocals and the submix chain. So I want to get right into it. In this particular case, I didn't want to put any singers on the spot in a YouTube video, so I brought in some hip-hop vocals, though we're talking about rock music. And I want to break into the processing chain here. If you've watched the first two videos, you know that I like to do gain staging for the subsequent processors. If you haven't watched this video, I either use a gain plugin or I use the Hornet VU plugin, which automatically gain stages for me. And what it does is it basically boosts or attenuates the level as you play through the track, so that at the loudest point in the track, it doesn't exceed 0 VU on a VU meter or negative 18 dB on the DAW meters. And that's not necessarily true because the DAW meters are representative of peak activity. But if you bring in the level meter in Logic and set it to RMS, which stands for averages, and negative 18, it shouldn't exceed, for the most part, negative 18. So once that's gain stage, for the subsequent processors that are generally most often emulating analog gear. And so we've got an optimum level now for those processors because volume does matter for analog plugins and gear. Then I'll use the channel EQ to high pass any low end content, subsonic content, or even kind of breaking into the low mids that just isn't necessary. That's, just kind of taking away from the headroom, taking away from the clarity of the mix. So I'll bring this up, depending on the vocalist, but probably 100 is a safe bet. And this is just removing unwanted noise. Once we do that, I use two compressors. The first one I set to vintage VCA, which is the SSL emulation in Logic. And I'll set the attack pretty quick, the release a little slower, ratio 4:1. And I'll bring down the threshold till it's, it's popping about 1 to 3 dB of gain reduction, tightening up the vocals a little bit. Then I'll use a second compressor, which is, this emulation emulates a dBx compressor, and there is no attack or release. And I'll just kind of bring down the thresholds till, it's popping between 1 and 3 dB. And the reason I use two compressors is because when you use one compressor and you just slam it, so, it's going up to negative 20 dB. It's very apparent that the compressor is being slammed. It's very distracting. And I like to go for more transparent sounds. I want it to be tightened. I want it to feel dynamically locked in, but I don't want it to hear the compressor reacting. So when you use more than one compressor and each one is just kind of taking off a little bit off the top, it's more transparent and you still get the same results. So then I use my trusty Soundtoys effects rack and I bring in Decapitator, which is basically a saturation/distortion plugin. Saturation is just the subtler version of distortion. It's like it thickens up a sound, it gives it more life, but it doesn't sound distorted. So I'll bring in Decapitator. I'll probably set the drive to 3 and I'll flip through these emulations till I find a tone that I like. From there, I'll bring in this SiQ plugin, which is just a really nice sounding EQ. I don't want you to get too focused on the plugins that I use, but just, my strategy. And I'll lift the top end on the SiQ. I'll probably take out a little out of the mid. Depends on the vocalist, but oftentimes I might not do much except just lift the top end to give it more presence and air. Once we've done that, we thickened it up a little bit with saturation, gave it more life, lifted the top end, did a little bit of tonal shaping with the EQ. I'll then bring in a de-esser, and this one is from a company called Clevgrand. I probably mispronounced that, but it's called Espresso, and I love it because it just is very easy to manipulate. You just drag and pull things around. I don't want to get too much into the functions of a de-esser, but the point of a de-esser is to tame aggressive sounding S's. When I say S, when I say espresso, it sounds relatively aggressive when you start adding compression and top end to the vocals, etc. And we use a de-esser to tame those S's it's basically like a compressor that just focuses on S sounds. So it brings them down in volume, makes them less aggressive, and pokes you less in the eye. And then I use an amazing plugin called Auto Volume from Melda Plugins. And it basically what it does is it listens to the incoming sound and it tries to boost or attenuate so that the sound is hanging around a specified level. And when we do this for vocals, it's called, vocal riding. And engineers of the past would listen to a vocal and then automate the volume. So they would, let's see here, set it to right. So I cut you off on the vocals, but basically we will push the volume up and down as the the vocals are going on to try to make the level more locked in. And, you could take several passes at this to get it right. And it's kind of flawed in my opinion because it's based on humans trying to react to things that are already have happened because they're listening, anticipating. So I bought this plugin and it's amazing because it just does it for you. So in this case, let's remove this automation. I'm going to play this vocal part for you, and we're just going to watch Auto Volume do its thing. You're going to watch this area here.
Leads to the sun, have you casting the light lately? It starts with the white light and the less set to fade in. It's more than myths and stories.
And it's going along, it's cooking and attenuating and boosting so the vocals sound tight in terms of volume. I mean, this can save you hours, days, weeks of your life. I love this plugin. I think it's brilliant. So at that point, we've tightened up the vocal sound, got rid of subsonic stuff, used a couple compressors, added saturation, did a little tonal shaping with EQ. My particular space is a little better than spaces I recorded in the past. So you might have to use more EQ than I do. When I was recording bedrooms and basements and stuff, I felt like I had to use a lot of EQ to get the vocals to sound palatable, and now not so much. So, it depends on your situation. I'm not a particular fan of a lot of videos that are just like, you just need a dB of this, you just need a dB of that. It's like, well, are you recording in a bedroom? No, I might need a little more than you do. So, it depends on your particular situation, but always try to err on the side of subtlety, because when processors get pushed hard, especially the ones that come with your DAW, it becomes very apparent very quickly. So at that point, I've tonally shaped and I've locked it in terms of timing and such. Then I'll send my vocals to a parallel bus that I call the Vocal Crush. And if you've watched the other videos, you've seen me use this processor, the Devil Lock. I use it gratuitously in my mixes. I love it. And it's a heavy-handed compressor. So I'll set Crush, which is compression, to 2, Crunch, which is distortion, to 2. I'll have the release set to fast, and then I'll leave everything else as is. So basically think compression, distortion, slammed. And then I will blend it in parallel to the original track. So, I'm not crushing the vocal track, but I'm adding a flatlined version to give it more stability and sturdiness. At that point, I'll use a plugin from Soundtoys called Microshift, which is a pitch shifter plugin. This thing is running in stereo, and it pitch shifts the vocals. So I'll play it for you. We'll send it to you there.
Starts with the white light and the less set to fade in. It's more than myths and stories.
So clearly some phasiness going on. Sounds a little weird, but the awesome thing about it is you blend it and it makes the vocals sound wider.
It's more than myths and stories steps. It's a shame that you haven't felt the vibrance yet. Starts with the white light and the less set to fade in. It's more than myths and stories steps.
And this particular plugin has, multiple modes, so you can kind of flip through that. You can do this with a pitch shifting plugin in your DAW, like one already comes with Logic, pitch shifter. You might just have to set up one bus and pan it to all the way to the right, and the other bus pan it all the way to the left, and then set these to, so the sensor maybe like 7 to the right, and on the left one, 7 to the left, to give that little bit, of a discrepancy between the two so that they widen up. I'll use that to widen the vocals. And then at this point, I'll use my trusty lift parallel channel, which I use a linear EQ to aggressively high pass to 2000 hertz. And I use the free plugin from Slate called Revival, and I'll set shimmer all the way to 100%. And what this does is it creates a very, exaggerated top end presence, and I will blend that in, subtly. So it's not being put on the vocal channel itself. It's side by side with the vocal channel, and I'm just blending it to add a little more air, a little more presence. And that's how I'll get my vocal processing. So now we've got the vocals plus these parallel channels. So in my mind, the vocals are being, this is like the whole vocal sound now. So now I'll collapse and have just my vocal bus. So all this is going to the vocal bus, which is being sent to the Slate VCC for console emulation to give it a little more console, vibe. And then I'll send all of this to my reverbs. So I'll send the whole vocal sound to a slap delay to give it a back wall type of feel with Echo Boy here. So we've set it to a 16th note delay, and it's just, adding a little bit of slap back, and you blend it in so it sounds like the vocalist is in a room somewhere. I'll also send my vocals to either 8th note, quarter note delay, or to both. And the awesome thing about these things is 8th note just kind of widens up the vocals again. It gives it more presence and more width in the mix. Quarter note is a more exaggerated, more spacey type of feel, so I'll use, if I feel the need to use that, it's probably for a specific effect. And then I'll send the vocals also to the all reverb channel, and this is a reverb channel I have for the entire mix. Either I'll use Space Designer maybe, or Valhalla Vintage Verb, and I'll set this to like a pretty airy preset, high, have the low cut all the way up, because we're just focusing in on the top end, and that's adding another layer of presence that we blend in. So now for the backup vocals and harmonies, generally I have the same vocalist doing the backing vocals, doing the harmonies. So I can just take this processing chain and copy it over. Now, if we have a different vocalist doing those things, then I'll use the same processing chain, but I'll have to, adjust the settings for that particular vocalist, because two different people with two different voices, with two different, dynamics and ways of going about singing. But I'll have a double crush. Well, the backing vocal, I call it double. So I have a crush channel for the backing vocal that I'll blend using Devil Lock. I'll also have a micro shift or pitch shifting parallel channel as well for the backing vocals, but I won't use the vocal lift. And that's because I want my main vocals to pop. I don't want the backing vocals to pop as much because they're supposed to be blended in the background. So I don't add the vocal lift to the harmonies or to the backing vocals because I want them to sit back a little bit. And then sometimes I'll use a little more aggressive compression on the backing vocals and harmonies because you want them to be sturdy. You want them to be back there and really locked in place and not poking out unnecessarily over the main vocals. So I'll get a little more aggressive with compression on those channels. And then at this point, I've got my mix 80% of the way there. I'll probably spend, more time just finessing things, take a walk, have a cup of coffee away from the mix, come back and then listen and start tightening things up. On the submix channel, which is my main output before my stereo output, I like to add some processing. So the virtual console collection from Slate, there's a per channel instance, which is what I have on each bus. And the reason I have it on each bus is basically because it's a CPU hog. It just takes away from my CPU. I might get more and more system overload messages. So instead, I just process it at the bus at each group level. So I get that console vibe without so many instances. But then you have to have the mix bus version on the submix because it kind of sums it all together to make it sound like it was ran through a console. So I have this all set to the same group, so it's sent to the same console emulation. I always use the Brit 4KE. I never mess with the drive. I just make sure that the mix is in its entirety is not going beyond 0 VU. And I use this trimmer plugin and dial it back if I need to do that to make sure at the loudest point, at the loudest section, it doesn't exceed 0 VU. So now the whole mix is gain stage properly for subsequent processors. I'll use the linear EQ to set a high pass filter just to 20 hertz. And to save you a bunch of science, what it does is it basically saves you from DC offset. And without getting too far into DC offset, it's just basically like when frequencies that hang around 0 hertz are present in your mixes and in your tracks, your speaker like doesn't really know, your monitors don't really know what to do with that information. So it's kind of like an audible limbo for the speaker. So just to save us from that, I just throw on a 20 hertz high pass filter and forget all about it. Then I use a compressor from Slate, the FG Gray, and it's like an SSL compressor, and I set this to a ratio of 3:1. I set the release to fast, the attack to relatively slow, and I just bring up the threshold till we get to a point where the compressor is just knocking at 1 dB, 2 dB of gain reduction. I'm just looking again for that kick drum to pop the compressor. I want to just tighten up the mix, add a little analog vibe, but nothing too crazy because the mastering engineer is going to need to be able to do his thing. So for me, it's more about vibe and just a little tightening up. And then finally, I will use the Slate virtual tape machine plugin, which adds a tape emulation to the whole mix. And it's just, again, another layer of analog vibe. I have, I try to have a good smattering of analog vibe with stuff that's not so analog-y. And we set this to a half-inch 2-track because this is the stereo track. It's not, the tracks one by one. And then I'll play with the tape type till it sounds good, and either 15 IPS or 30. I think probably, whichever one's the slower one, I guess. And I'll just gain stage this so the meter, again, isn't going beyond 0 VU. And that's the extent of my bus processing. I mean, there are a lot of people who suggest doing the top-down approach, which is where you start with the submix and work your way down. I'm not a big fan of the start from the top and work your way down. I like starting at the bus level because I feel like you're doing the mastering engineer's job before the mastering engineer had a chance to do his job. I also feel like it's not a good idea to start at the track level because why would I start processing a kick drum when the drums as a whole need some fine tuning and shaping? It's like the forest for the trees type of situation. Again, when a sculptor goes to sculpt a statue, he's not starting with the nose and the eyes. He's just trying to get the basic form out of it. So at this point, I also have a couple plugins on the actual stereo output. More often than not, this will actually end up over here, but this is the L1 compressor from Waves, or limiter rather. And I use this plugin to make sure that I don't exceed 0 on the peak meters. So we're not going into the red and we're not getting digital distortion from the DAW. But also when you send mixes out to clients, they get really weirded out very easily if the track is not as loud comparatively to mixes that they have on their iPod, their iPhone, whatever. So we bring down the threshold till it's pretty much slamming and comparatively loud to other commercial mixes. So to me, like I'm fine with the volume being a little lower, but clients get really weirded out. And also, it's just they can't compare it to their favorite mixes when there's a dramatic drop in volume. So, it's not just that they're weird. So we have a limiter on the final output just to make sure we're not exceeding 0 on the meters. So I set it to -0.1. And then I bring down the threshold till, and this is about when I've hit about 80% of my mix. Like I'm 80% confident in my mix. I got some fine tuning and stuff. At this point, I'll bring down the threshold to about -10, -12. So, it's attenuating a little bit and it's comparatively loud to other mixes that are in the commercial world. I have this AB plugin from Sample Magic that I use to load in reference mixes. I load a sound, and then I'll go into my music folder, and we'll just say, we'll bring in this song. And this is an easy way for me to compare my mix to my references to see if I'm on the right track. Then we have the multimeter, which is an amazing meter you plug in Logic, and it just shows me a frequency spectrum of what's going on. If I'm too, heavy in the low end, too heavy in the top end, level meters, correlation meter for phase relationships. And that's about the extent of it. I really hope that was helpful to you. I really would love to hear any questions or comments that you have. And again, if you haven't gone to the blog yet, there should be a link down below. If you click on that link, it'll take you to the blog post for this video, and there's a free Logic Pro 10 mix template that is exactly like the one that you see here in this video series. The same groups, everything. But the only difference is, instead of these third-party plugins I use, I've set it up so it uses only Logic plugins. And for each track, if you open the notepad, there are very, very well thought out notes, or I guess that's presumptuous, but there's detailed notes about like what processors I used, why, what each track is being sent to what bus, and strategies and best practices for you to consider while you're using it for mixing rock music on your own. So thank you again. I appreciate you taking the time.